Hello, my dear friends, and good morning or good afternoon. My name is Nevyana and I'm professor at Sofia University. Today I will present my study entitled Explainable Artificial Intelligence for Modeling Invisible Academic Work in Gamified Higher Education Environments. The main idea behind this research is quite simple, but important. In digital education, we can observe many student activities through learning management systems. We can see logins, session duration, submissions, forum participation, points, budgets, and other forms of interaction. However, a significant part of academic work is not directly visible in these systems. Students may spend hours preparing for an exam, reading, thinking, discussing a problem informally, or working outside the platform. These activities can require substantial effort, but they may leave little or no digital trace. My study therefore asks whether machine learning can help us computationally reconstruct some of these less visible dimensions from observable digital behavior, while using explainable artificial intelligence to understand how the models reach their results. The problem: what remains invisible? The starting point of the study is distinction between what educational platforms can observe and what students can actually do. Learning analytics has created new opportunities for understanding students' behavior through digital traces. However, these traces are necessarily incomplete. For example, a platform may record that a student logged in for 20 minutes, but this does not tell us whether the student spent another 3 hours reading, preparing, discussing the material with colleagues, or solving problems offline. The same problem appears in the opposite direction. A student may have many platform interactions without necessarily engaging deeply with the learning material. Gamification makes the situation even more interesting. Points, badges, progress indicators, and continuous feedback create additional behavioral data. At the same time, they may encourage students to continuously monitor and optimize their performance. Therefore, the central problem is that digital visibility is not the same as academic effort. This study explores whether some of these invisible dimensions can be computationally approximated from observable behavior patterns without claiming the digital traces provide a complete picture of the student's experience. The theoretical background combines four perspectives. First, learning analytics provides the foundation for using digital traces to understanding student behavior. However, previous research also emphasizes the limitations on these traces because many learning activities remain outside the observable digital environment. Second, gamification introduces additional measurable signals such as points, badges, achievements, and progress indicators. These mechanisms can support engagement, but they can also increase self-monitoring and the pressure of continuously optimized performance. Third, the study draws a self-determination theory, particularly the importance of autonomy, competence, and relativeness for sustainable motivation. This is relevant because highly monitored digital environments may create tension between engagement and perceived autonomy. Finally, I use explainable artificial intelligence, specifically SHAP, to interpret the machine learning models. This is important because in education it is not sufficient to know that the model produces a particular result. We also need to understand which behavioral features contribute to that result. So, theoretically, the study connects learning analytics, gamification, student autonomy, and explainable artificial intelligence. Research questions and contributions. Based on this theoretical background, the study addresses 3 research questions. The first question asks whether theoretically defined latent educational constructs can be computationally reconstructed from observable LMS and temporal behavioral traces. The second question asks whether non-linear in-symbol models, specifically random forest and XGBoost, can reconstruct these relationships more accurately than a linear regression baseline. The third question focuses on explainability, which observable behavioral features contribute most strongly to the reconstruction of perceived stress. There are 4 main contributions. First, I proposed an explainable machine learning framework for modeling theoretically defined latent educational constructs. Second, I use synthetic data to create a controlled research environment without relying on sensitive institutional student data. Third, I compare linear and nonlinear machine learning approaches. And fourth, I use SHAP to make the model outputs interpretable. An important point is that the goal is not to predict real students at this stage. The purpose is to test whether the theoretically embedded relationships can be computationally recovered under controlled conditions. Proposed computational framework. This slide presents the overall computational framework. The workflow consists of 4 main stages. The first stage is synthetic behavioral data generation. I created LMS-like observations representing different dimensions of student digital behavior. The second stage is exploratory behavioral clustering. K-means was used to identify groups of observations with similar behavioral characteristics. The third stage is supervised machine learning reconstruction. Here, observable behavioral indicators are used to reconstruct 3 theoretically defined latent constructs: the invisible work index, perceived stress level, and perceived autonomy score. The fourth stage is explainable AI. SHAP is used to investigate which features contribute most strongly to the model inputs. The important conceptual distinction is between the left and the right slides of the framework. On the left we have observable digital traces. On the right we have constructs that cannot be directly observed through conventional LMS data. The machine learning models therefore act as computational reconstruction mechanisms. This framework allows us to investigate the relationships while keeping clear that the latent constructs are simulated and theoretically defined rather than directly measure psychological variables. Synthetic dataset and latent constructs. The simulated dataset contains 1,000 students' records. The variables were designed to represent several categories of observable digital behavior. These include LMS interactions such as login frequency, session duration, and forum participation. They also include temporal behaviors such as night activity ratio, temporal depression, and submission timing. Assessment behavior is represented through quiz completion and submission delay. Finally, gamification is represented through indicators such as points, budgets, and progress interactions. From these observable varieties and variables, three latent constructs were generated. The first is the invisible work index, or IWI, representing academic effort occurring outside the visible digital environment. The second is the perceived stress level, or PSL, representing simulated workload-related pressure. The third is the perceived autonomy score, or PAS, representing the perceived degree of learner control in a digitally monitored environment. These constructs were generated using theoretically informed relationships combined with stochastic variation. This last point is important. The data were not generated deterministically. Random variation was introduced in order to create behavioral diversity. But again, these are synthetic constructs. They are useful for testing the computational framework, but they are not measurements of actual student stress, autonomy, or invisible work. Machine learning methodology. After generating the data, I applied both unsupervised and supervised machine learning. For the unsupervised analysis, I used k-means clustering to explore behavioral profiles. The number of clusters were selected using the elbow method of silhouette analysis. For supervised reconstruction, I compared three models. The first was linear regression, which served as a baseline and allowed comparison with a relatively simple linear relationship. The second was random forest, which can capture nonlinear relationship and interactions between variables. The third was XGBoost, another nonlinear ensemble method that is particularly effective for structured data. The models were evaluated using two standard metrics: root mean square error, where lower values are better, and R squared, where higher values indicate better reconstruction. Finally, SHAP was used to explain the contribution of individual features. The models were evaluated using five-fold cross-validation, and the results were averaged across the folds. Results and behavioral profiles. The first major result comes with the k-means clustering. The analysis identified three behavioral profiles within the simulated population. The first profile is characterized by high LMS engagement, increased off-hours activity, and elevated reconstructed stress levels. The second represents a more balanced engagement profile with moderate interaction intensity and intermediate workload indicators. The third profile shows lower digital participation and lower reconstructed stress characteristics. These clusters demonstrate that unsupervised learning can identify internally consistent behavioral structure in the simulated environment. However, I want to emphasize an important methodological caution. This should not be interpreted as real categories of students. For example, we should not say that a real student who logs in frequently belongs to a high-stress student category. The clusters only demonstrate that under the assumptions embedded in the synthetic data, machine learning can identify different combinations of behavioral characteristics. The supervised learning results provide a clear comparison between the models. Linear regression achieved RMSE of 0.58 and an R-squared of 0.62. Random forest improved the reconstruction with an RMSE of 0.41 and R-squared of 0.79. The best results were obtained by XGBoost with RMSE of 0.38 and R-squared of 0.83. The results therefore suggest that the nonlinear ensemble models were better able to recover the relationships embedded in the synthetic data. However, this is exactly where interpretations need to be careful. An R-squared of 0.83 does not mean that we can predict real student stress with 83% accuracy. It means that within the controlled synthetic environment, the XGBoost model was able to recover a large proportion of the simulated relationship. The SHAP analysis provides an additional layer of interpretation. The most influential features were night activity ratio, submission delay, and lodging per day. This suggests that temporal organization of learning activity may contain more information about the simulated stress construct than interaction frequency alone. In particular, the importance of night activity and submission delay points toward temporal fragmentation as an interesting area for future empirical research. The SHAP analysis is therefore useful not simply because it tells us which model is best, but because it helps us to formulate more specific hypotheses about students' behavior. Robustness, discussion, and implications. Because the dataset is synthetic, I did not treat conventional external validation as possible at this stage. Instead, I performed a robustness analysis. The simulation parameters and noise levels were moderately perturbed, approximately within a range of plus or minus 10 to 20%. I was repeated the clustering procedure and used bootstrap resampling. The main behavioral indicators continued to be among the most important predictors. They support the initial structural consistency of the computational framework, although it does not provide empirical validation. The findings also have several broader implications. First, the learning analytics, they reinforce the idea that digital traces should be interpreted as partial evidence rather than complete representation of learning. Second, for gamification, increased engagement should not automatically be interpreted as improved student experience. Gamified environments generate more behavioral data, but more measurement does not necessarily mean better understanding. Third, for the artificial intelligence in education, accuracy should not be the only objective. Transparency, autonomy, privacy, and responsible interpretation are equally important. This connects the study with the broader perspective of human-centered AI and Industry 5.0, where technology is expected to support people rather than simply organize measurable performance. Limitations, future work, and conclusion. To conclude, the most important limitation of this study is also its main methodological characteristic. The data is synthetic. The results therefore cannot be interpreted as evidence about real student populations. The invisible work index, perceived stress level, and perceived autonomy score are theoretically enforced computational constructs, but they still require validation using authentic student experiences and established measurement instruments. Future research should therefore more toward empirical validation with ethically collected institutional data. This could include validated psychological measures of stress, workload, and autonomy, qualitative research, longitudinal learning analytics, and potentially multimodal data. Privacy, consent, fairness, and learner autonomy will also be essential considerations. The main conclusion of this study is that machine learning can provide a useful computational framework for exploring dimensions of academic work that are not directly visible in digital learning platforms. The results particularly suggest that temporal behavioral patterns, such as night activity and submission timing, deserve further investigation. But the central message is not that AI can see invisible academic work. Rather, it is digital traces can provide signals about hidden dimensions of learning while remaining incomplete representations of students' experience. Therefore, educational AI should combine computational capability with explainability, ethical responsibility, and respect for the student autonomy. Thank you very much for your attention and have a very nice day.